Now that we have this post table ready for it to be synced with the online or cloud database to an offline SQLite database, it is time for us to start actually syncing them. And to be able to sync that, we are going to be creating a new class inside of the view model folder. This is not exactly going to be a view model to a certain view or going to be connected to a certain model. It is simply going to be additional functionality that we will be needing. And to be able to perform that sync, we are going to be adding a new class to the helpers folder. We are basically going to be creating a helper class that will perform this sync for us. So we are simply going to be creating a new class that we are going to be calling Azure App Service Helper. This class will have to be public because we will be accessing it from other parts of our project. And the first thing that it is going to be requiring is a call to the push async method that is coming directly from the sync context. If you remember, we have already accessed the sync context when we are establishing that the local SQLite database is going to be its local counterpart. Now that we have established this, we can actually make a push in case there is something that we have to push over to the cloud. And of course, pulls, so we know that if there were any updates or if we simply want to get, if the internet is available, the things that are inside of the cloud database for the first time, we know that locally we already have the information available. So to be able to do that, we will have to do a couple of things. First, I will have to define right at the top of this file a certain variable, simply a definition, that we will have the offline sync enabled. So to be able to do that, we're going to be doing something that we probably haven't done before. We are going to be creating a define, and in all caps, offline sync enabled. So this is a symbol that will allow us to set the project to have certain code paths included in the build. And the second thing that we will need is to define a certain type of error that we will have to evaluate in case there probably is no internet, or if the syncing didn't happen, maybe we are trying to insert something that is already there. We are simply going to have a variable that is going to be a collection of errors. So we can do that by using the read-only collection. This is not going to be the interface. We are going to be needing a class, so we are going to use the system.collection.object model namespace. And this is going to be a collection of mobile service table operation error. For this, we of course need another namespace, and we are simply going to be calling this sync errors. And at the beginning, this is going to be null. Eventually, this will hold any amount of errors that may happen during the syncing, either when we push or when we pull information from the database. So now that we have this, we will be able to perform precisely those pulls and pushes. So now we will need the method that is going to be performing that sync. And actually this variable, the sync errors, could exist within that method. We are not going to be using it outside of it. So we can define this as public. It's going to be static. Is going to be async. It's going to be performing tasks with the internet. So this may take a while. It will have to be a task because we know this may take some time. And this is going to be called sync async. Simply to let the user know that this is an asynchronous method. And so right after the definition of this sync errors variable, preferably inside a try-catch block, we are going to be performing first the push of any changes that may have happened with the local database. And we are going to precisely be using that sync context that we have already used and defined and initialized that is inside of our mobile service. So remember that the mobile service has a sync context. All we have to do is call the push async method. And because this is an async method, we will have to await it. Just like this, we will be able to push any changes that happened in the local database to the cloud database. And by the way, to be able to use it without needing to pass any other parameter, we will need the same namespace that we are using with sync, but without the sync, so Microsoft.Windows Azure.mobile services. And I am also missing the catch blocking here. We're simply going to be catching any exception, but in here we are going to be needing to catch a different particular type of exception that may happen and that we will have to keep track of through the sync errors variable. So before, of course, the general exception catch, we are going to be catching the mobile service push failed exception. So these may happen when we call the push async. And this is going to be called MSPFE, which just stands for mobile service push failed exception. And in case this particular exception happens, we have to evaluate if this MSPFE variable has a push result that is different than null. And if it is, it means that we had a collection of errors when we tried to call the push async method, and we should, to the sync errors, assign those push results. So MSPFE dot push result and get any errors that happened during this push async. So just like this, we have already handled the ability of our local database to push changes to the cloud. Now let's take a look at how we can do the pulling of the information. And this is going to be the first time that we use the posts table that we have already defined. And that is now the interface, as I said before, that we will use to make all of these requests. So after calling the push async, we'll have to call, maybe you guessed it, a pull async method. That is still going to be coming from a variable that was defined in the app class, but that is now the posts table. Again, this is going to be the interface to any functionality, any call that we want to use with the database. And this is going to contain the pull async method. This is going to require a couple of strings. The first one defining the query ID. The query ID is usually simply a small amount of characters that allows us to identify this particular query. For example, we can simply call it posts. Or if we can make it a little bit more specific, user posts. So we know that these posts should only contain the posts from the current user. And the second string is precisely going to be the query, which for now I'm just going to leave empty and make sure that I call the await method. So basically this method is going to pull all the information from the cloud version of the database to the local database. It's simply the other part of the synchronization. We have already pushed, now we can pull. Of course, you need to push first any changes that are locally, just in case there are new changes. Now the cloud database contains them, and after that, and only after that, pull any other information that may have been pushed from other instances of the application. This is how you perform that syncing, pushing and pulling from the cloud database to a local database that will now contain the information, the same information as the cloud database, readily available even when there is no internet. Two benefits: one, you can use the application without internet. Two, even if there is internet, you will first be using the local database, so any request to the database will execute much faster. Again, in this particular application may not be that noticeable, but in a more robust application with more data bigger databases, it is definitely going to be noticeable. Now, there is another thing that we have to perform before moving forward to the next lecture, and that is to create a small amount of code for simple error or conflict handling. In particular, right now, for the case when the push fails. So, right after the catch block, we are going to be evaluating if sync errors is different than null, which would mean that there were some errors that this exception was caught and that we assign the sync errors to certain errors when the push was performed. So in this case, of course, errors is a collection, so we will have to evaluate each and every one of the errors that may be contained inside. So I'm going to use a for each loop to get an error for each and every one of the errors in sync errors. And what I can do in here is evaluate if the operation kind of the error was an error in the update. This particular evaluation will allow me to know if I should revert to the server's copy. This would happen if there was an error updating an item. If there was an error updating an item, I should not want this item to be in my copy, so I will have to revert to the server's copy. This evaluation can be applied to simply the operation kind property of the error and evaluate if it is equal to a mobile service table operation kind of type update. So notice that we could also evaluate for delete or insert. We're going to be doing this when updating. So if this is the operation kind, we should revert the update to the previous state. And also, by the way, evaluate if the result of the error is different than null. So in this case is when we have to revert to the server's copy. And we can do that through the error itself. We can simply cancel the operation. So the cancel and update item async method is going to do that for us, and what it is going to need is precisely that result. That we have just evaluated is not null. Remember, that is why the second part of the evaluation is very important. And because this is async, we will have to await this call. If this is not the case, if the operation kind was different or maybe the result was null, we are simply going to discard the local change. Remember that we are still evaluating an error. This was still an error. And we have just evaluated that if this was an update, we're going to revert to the server's copy. If this was a different kind of error or the result was null, we are going to be discarding the local change. So remember that by this time, before doing the push, there was already a change in the local database. If we were unable to update for any reason, maybe the item was deleted from somewhere else, I don't know, any reason at all that we are not able to update in the cloud, we should not have that in the local database. So we are going to discard that local change. And that can also be done through the error and through the cancel and discard item async. This does not receive any parameters, but we do have to await its goal. And that's it. This is everything that we need to do for simple error and conflict handling. Now in the next lecture, we're going to start to call this method. So we are actually going to be syncing this information, as well to do a couple of changes here and there so we can actually start to use the local database instead of only the cloud hosted database.